thrilled to welcome you here today. And, well, we had this brief moment where I was watching you and you were watching me, not knowing exactly when we were going to start. I was reminded, it's a personal story, but since I have the stage, I get to tell it. I was married in this room 12 years ago. It was the first wedding that took place in the new building here in 1991. And I could lay the room out for you if you'd like and tell you where it is, but I won't bore you with the details. But I do have a hard time coming into the room and not thinking of a wedding here, even if it was mine. This has been an amazing summer session for us. I hope it has been for you. It always seems, as we start to wind down toward the end of the week, somewhat of a letdown or a how could it be over so soon? And I hope you share that feeling, because I love people leaving with the feeling of wanting more rather than just feeling that was enough. So I hope you do leave, but please leave when you're done with tomorrow, because we got a lot of other things we got to do over the course of the year. This summer, by the way, in the fun facts to know category, we have people here from 33 states, 9 countries. It's the most, in terms of countries, the greatest representation we've ever had. That's from South Korea, Germany, Japan, Canada, Mexico, Puerto Rico, England, Scotland, and Virgin Islands. And we do welcome you, those of you who are here with us today from around the world. It's a real treat. Also this summer, we have more press coverage than we've ever received before. And whoever knows the press in the room and got us this, thank you. This is great. We have coverage this summer from WABC News. It was on the other night. I don't know if you happened to catch it. It was on at 5:30. We have copies, and we will sign copies if you're interested. New York One, New York Times, Associated Press, Newsday, New York Sun, Daily News, Impacto Latin News, and El Diario. And we're absolutely thrilled because it means that the message is getting out more and more and more about the work that we all do within aesthetic education. I have several different roles today. One is to say a few words prior to role number 2, which is introducing Dr. Greene, and role number 3 is to introduce the performance. I brought props today. I decided that I needed some props for my presentation today. Prop number 1 is the book that we're very proud of. This is in the both shameless self-promotion category, but also in it's a good read. We have a new book out that's called Community in the Making, Lincoln Center Institute, The Arts in Teacher Education. And I'm really pleased to say that a good number of the authors who wrote chapters for this book are here with us today. And I would love to formally embarrass them by asking them to stand up. Seema Brain, Helen Johnson, Gary Ross, Ricky Asher, Sandrea Domenico, Roberta Altman, Kinsala Salkangas Kramer. And if there's anyone else that I forgot, please stand up. Did I forget anyone? You can impersonate someone and get applaud. And if you see Maddie Holzer, Scott Noppy Brandon, and forward by Maxine Greene, and several of you have even come up and asked us to autograph the books, which just is a huge treat and blows my mind. Maxine talked last time, in fact, both times, as she does often, mentioned the imagination and the key role imagination plays in our work. And I was thinking about a paper that I wrote recently for Education Update, which is a journal I write for. And I wrote in, and I'd like to just share a couple of thoughts with you, that the 9/11 Commission, when it spoke of, when it talked about the terrible events of 9/11, it talked about it as a failure of the imagination. But it went on, which to me was the absolutely most important part, Governor Keene and others talked about the need to routinize and bureaucratize imagination. Talk about two contradictory notions, routinizing, bureaucratizing imagination. But in a certain sense, they're right. And in a certain sense, if it's to be part of our everyday vocabulary, if it's to be something that's not outside of who we are as individuals, then we do have to think of it as if it is as common as something that's routinized and bureaucratized. I went on to talk about how do you do that? I mean, how could you ever do that in a society as complex as ours? And quite frankly, I haven't a clue. But the only thing that comes to mind is the schools, because it's the only place where we have the ability to educate people or introduce people to concepts that has some common denominator, some common element to it, as diverse and as individual as education always will be in the United States. But I was reminded once again the sheer importance of imagination if we're talking about it as it relates to some of the most hideous, horrendous events of certainly my lifetime, but also of how we move forward as a society. And I also like to say it's at this point where I stop talking about it because I know Maxine will start and she'll make sense of it in a way that I never can or could. The other props I have with me is to try to put introducing Maxine in a context. Everyone knows that Maxine has been our philosopher in residence since 1975, but I'm not sure you know the story of exactly how that came about. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story. In 1972, prop number 2, on the front page of the New York Times, along with the Apollo launch and U.S. Prepared to extend North Vietnam bombing, is an article on the bottom, Lincoln Center proposes wider youth involvement. Now you got to appreciate this. Front page of the New York Times in 1972. I like to joke that today we could not get coverage of the Institute even on Metro unless we had a ritual sacrifice of a teacher each Sunday. And I don't think I'm far off. But if you flip to section 2 on page 36, it talks about Mr. Schubart explained in an interview that he felt most youth programs by arts organizations appealed basically to young people already interested in the arts. What we need to do is to try to get the other 96% of the population. The proposal calls for a new arts organization just for youth. Mr. Schubart calls it the Squiggle, which became the book that Mark ended up writing, became known as The Hunting of the Squiggle, and already elicited much interest from then State Commissioner of Education, Mr. Nyquist, who said in a letter that he found this work educationally exciting and strikingly imaginative. I am of the opinion that there is an increasing need for organizations outside of the formal school structure which can serve as resources in the educational process, Mr. Nyquist wrote. And he goes on to talk about why he thought cultural organizations' role in education would be so important. That led to Mark going back and reevaluating the work that had occurred at Lincoln Center for many years, which was called the student program. And you're going to be quizzed on this at the end, so you better pay attention. For 14 years, there was a program here where students were brought to Lincoln Center or performances were taken out to the schools, but there was no educational context that surrounded the work. It was purely performance only. And when Mark retired, he gave me this prop number 3, which says, "Dear performers, I saw you dance at the high school on Friday. I liked it a little. Sincerely, John Dean." You get the point. No, it's not John Dean from that one. Don't tie the two together. How many even know that reference? Mark decided at that point that he needed help. He needed a lot of help to figure out how to take it from a resource, exposure-based effort to create something new that didn't exist in the mid-70s, to create an educational enterprise in a cultural organization, in fact, what is the largest cultural organization in the country, if not the world, and turn that into truly an educational enterprise in and through the arts. he had the good sense to go up to Teachers College to meet with then president of Teachers College, Larry Kremen. And Larry said, President Kremen said, I didn't know him, so I guess I can't call him Larry, that there's this person you need to meet. She's the answer. She's the person who can help you figure out how to turn this from what you had, what you did, into what it should be. And her name is Dr. Maxine Greene. She's a philosopher of education. She's the person that talks the language and thinks the way you are. And if you're looking for someone who can help you figure out how to do this in this great culture organization, you need to meet Maxine. 30 years later, Maxine is still our philosopher in residence, and it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to Dr. Maxine Greene.
Scott seems to be taking lessons in stand-up with me. Then it gets deeper and more complicated, and I appreciate him. And without him, obviously, this couldn't happen. It's joy, pricked with a few annoyances and a few disagreements, that I think back at our law association, and how wonderful it was, and how wonderful it is now that he's betting that I'll live a little longer. That's a big thing. Even as the Summer Institute draws to a close, I think we find it especially rewarding to greet those of you who are newcomers to what we're trying to do. The presence of newcomers means that there's something ongoing, something being kept alive, and it wants something beginning. And what is a beginning? A beginning, wrote Edward Said, must be thought possible. It must be taken to be possible before it can be one. The mind's work, in order to be done, occasionally requires the possibility of freedom, of a new cleanness, of prospective achievement, excuse me, of special and novel appropriation. The mind's work, yes. If the mind is seen as a verb and not a noun, I especially like that in Dewey when he insists that we think of mind as a verb and not a noun. Mind as a mode of being, as a mode of action, acting along with others or in response to others, since there can be no mindfulness without relationship, without culture or community. You will find work for the mind to do here, but not in isolation from other human powers: imagination, perception, feeling, empathy, the body of movement. That's one of the rare and wonderful things that happens here in our workshops when teachers work with teaching artists. A wonderful integration of human capacities, so many of which are excluded in so many schools and so many institutions. Here, to have imagination and mind and empathy and the body all come together remains a kind of miracle. And having been in a workshop this morning with a dancer, Susan Thomason, working with poetry, working with movement, working with a mask, I felt that feeling of the miraculous again, when things come together and you see what you never saw, and you feel what you never feel. And then there's the capacity to make metaphors, to find unexpected patterns and connections, to wonder, to pose questions, to come awake, and by coming awake, to see more, to notice more, to attend more carefully to the particulars of a terribly troubled world. And obviously, I think, like many of you, when I think of thinking of particulars as the arts enable us to do, I think of how important it is to break through the statistics. Like it said this morning, 800 Iraqis were killed in a bombing. Meant most of the children. And I think what we have, one of the things we learn here is to see through the generalization, see through the stereotype, and try to imagine an actual child hit by a bomb, and not back away behind the statistics, back away behind the bureaucratization that Scott was talking about before. Obviously, we can't thrust aside the darkness, the suffering of the world around, nor can we seek out refuge in the arts or in somnolence or denial. I know there are people who come to the arts because they can forget it all. They can deny it all. Of course, there have to be moments when you're a little more at ease, but the arts must not be thought of as refuge. They must be thought of as means of awakening, means of seeing, means perhaps of finding out what to do. Here, by means of what we call aesthetic education, we work with you to enable you to enlarge and enhance your experiences with diverse works of art. Flamenco dancing, the sounds and shapes of the blues, the skeletal figures of Giacometti, Kandinsky's frenzies of color, Picasso's disruptions of familiar space. In fact, the defamiliarization of multiple spaces and bodies and faces, so that more often than not, the comfortable coverings fall off, the crusts of convention are broken, and we realize how much our perceiving is incomplete, how much there remains to be seen, to be touched, to be felt, how necessary it is to move beyond the familiar and to take it for granted. I want to stress the fact that the aesthetic educator, be she or he classroom teacher or professor or teaching the kind of teaching that does not hold up a work of art as a finished thing, to be admired or wondered at or taken over by those to whom explanations are addressed. We consider the changing processes of awareness, the journeys, if you like, to be beginnings in Said's sense, freedom and a sense of possible achievement. We speak of a kind of participant learning that may make this more likely. We have, as you know, workshops by means of which teaching artists enable you to become acquainted with dimensions of their craft, their art form. The dance workshop, for instance, may transform us from mere spectators of the flamenco, awed and slightly distanced, to virtual participants, able at least to feel and resonate to the beat of the feet, to the beat of the feet, the complex patterns of arms and hands, the rhythmic wailing of voice and guitar, because we have learned even rudimentary movements. And I think there are very few of us who exited last night or the night before able to do the flamenco. That's unlikely, but you learned the rudiments of it, and you learned enough in somehow to bring your energy into the dance, to activate the dance as you watched it, to activate it for yourself. Because we have learned, we begin to listen and look in ways that involve our pulses, our breathing, our muscles, even our lips. Many of you can think back the way probably I can. When I first went to ballet or saw the Red Shoes, you know, I only thought about the story. I only thought it was an enactment of a story. It was only after being here that I noticed the turn of a hand, the finger, the gesture, and the dance became something quite other. I used to go to the museum and also see stories, but I wasn't able to notice nuance and color and negative space and the kind of experience that is inexhaustible. Because as many of you know, an experience with a work of art can't be used up. Just try to listen to the Seventh Symphony for a couple of days and see if you hear the same thing. You won't. Or try to go back to a great painting that you love, whether it's a Picasso or a Caravaggio or a Edward Hopper, and you feel that if, as you go back, it changes, it deepens, more connections appear in your thinking. You get older, you change, the world changes, and the picture changes, and you can never exhaust, never use up an authentic artistic experience. A contact, we tell people, an interplay begins between the performers and the perceivers if they have learned about what it means to attend. And an event may occur almost like an electric spark, and something happens in experience, a new fullness, a new reaching beyond, and an event, if you like, that we call an aesthetic experience. It's necessary to note that this is most likely to occur when imagination, as Scott was suggesting, leave it to me, I'm sorry. It's not wine anyway. Thank you. It's the imagination means, if it means any particular thing, the ability to look at things as if they could be otherwise, as if our ordinary bodies could move for a while like those of the dancers, as if our muscle memory could store up some of the grace, some of the power of the dancers, and somehow change our lives. Imagination, exploring untapped possibilities in the work, in ourselves, stirs us, offers us alternative reality, alternatives to violence, to bombing and ferocity. Imagination sums up alternative possibilities for motherless babies and injured children and silenced human beings. This morning in our workshop, I was recalling the great Italian writer Italo Calvino, who talks about the civilization of images in which we live, of comics, of commercials, and so on, and about how difficult it is to free people to summon up their own images, their authentic images, to open up their own visions. And I think that's so important. And he talks about a pedagogy of imagination. And a pedagogy of imagination is the capacity to discover the stored up images and not to comply with television images, with everything that batters our eyes, that batters children. And I think it's a responsibility and a thrill if you ask. I think that that imagination, along with the possibility of confronting what T.S. Eliot called our private terrors and our particular shadows, can initiate the kind of self-reflection that may be the ground for critical consciousness. At once might they not alter our relation between subject and object in such a way as to help the individual question the apparent givenness or objectness of surrounding phenomena, oppression, injustice, poverty, all derived from human fabrications and agreements. Might they not realize on some level that perception itself can be transformed, that all our perspectives are incomplete, ambiguous, that cognitive certainties falsify compared with the provisional nature of the perceived? always partial, always incomplete profiles to be completed, if at all, through dialogue and multiple fluid perspectives of others. Albert Camus always comes to mind when I write, with his dramatic account of living in a deadly, repetitive life, until one day it is as if the scenery falls away, and he has a view of what it signifies to be entrapped unthinkingly in routines, entrapped that way, until one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Begins, he says. This is important. Weariness comes at the end of a mechanical life, but at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness, which is one of the important things we have in mind. Mechanical life, often accepted, often complied with by people, is the kind of life which accepts behavior rather than action, daily life, that is timed, is measured, and that turns toward an unpredictable future. We require the activity of imagination, a passion for the possible, images or ideas of what might be, of what should be, what is not yet. We ought every day, aside from condoling, think of, if we can, imagine a decent life for the women and children of Darfur, for the homeless and wounded little ones in the Baghdad streets before their bombed out homes. What shelter should be provided for the children of war? What sorts of schools do they need? What kind of literacy? As members of a culture, as curious, wondering, changing beings who may have to struggle to be. I'm struggling myself to find the point of critical consciousness in these times and in this place. It is simply to educate ourselves, to transform ourselves into more alive and more committed human beings? Is it to intensify our ability to name the world as we engage more and more deeply with the several arts? Is it to diversify our dialogues with others so that we can reach out further and engage with the others that surround us and have so much to do with the creation of our identities? And coming to an end, I quote Benjamin Barber, who wrote, "Human association depends on imagination, the capacity to see in others beings like ourselves. It is through imagination that we render others sufficiently like ourselves for them to become subjects of tolerance and respect and sometimes even affection. Democracy is not a natural form of association. It is an extraordinary and rare contrivance of cultivated imagination." Barber, like many of us, believes that democracy requires the arts. John Dewey also believed that learning, and we would add transformational learning, had somehow to be infused with imagination if it were to communicate significant ideas, critical of some of the specialized work confined to the realm of facts. He wrote that facts are only data, fragmentary, uncompleted meanings, unless they are rounded out into complete ideas, a work that can only be done by a free imagination of intellectual possibilities. They are as helpless as are all named things, and as repellent as needlessly thwarted ones. I want only to relate the release of various voices, diverse voices, and empowerment by education in multiple literacies, and crucially in the arts, to the tentative sounds of resistance to the bureaucratization Scott was referring to, and to the misuses of power. It's not the first time that education for becoming, for reflection, and for imaginative awakenings was falsified and undermined and forgotten. But it may be the first time that education for the release of human powers was attacked from so many sides on the part of people finding justification in a sense of power, sometimes to what they unforgivably call God. The transformation of education is no longer merely an academic matter or a matter of cheerful generalizations and cliches. It is a political struggle and pedagogical struggle, and as Barbara says, an imaginative struggle, even an aesthetic struggle. And if the function of the arts is to open windows on the possible, on what might be and what ought to be, it has to be an aesthetic struggle as well. I choose to conclude, as I did the other day, with some words by T.S. Eliot, because of the way I started. And as I said, T.S. Eliot might not have agreed with me, but he says things in ways I could never say them. And so each venture, he says, is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate. There is only the fight to recover what is lost and found again and lost again and again. And now, under conditions that seem unpropitious, but perhaps neither gain nor loss, for us there is only the trying. And we welcome you to an ongoing effort to try. And thank you very much.